Hello, I'm Davina William, and welcome to this special edition of Nzone Focus, which commemorates Anzac Day and remembers all those who laid down their lives for our freedom. Shortly, I'll be talking with the Wellington author of a new book aimed at helping younger generations understand the significance of Anzac Day. We hear the story of Scottish woman Jane Haining, whose love for the children she taught determined her path when war broke out. And from Hamilton, a memorial service to commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day. Anzac Day, the New Zealand story, was originally written for 8 to 12-year-olds, but it's already appealing to a much wider age group. As author Philippa Wery explained, increasing numbers of people of all ages are keen to know more about the history of Anzac Day.
I think sometimes we think that Anzac Day is history, which it is, but it's also a day that's changing a lot over the years. And when you look at the way that it has changed from how Anzac Day was first celebrated straight after the war, when it was quite a mournful ceremony, remembering the people that had only died a few years before, and then maybe to the 50s and 60s, it was still very sombre and you couldn't do anything on Anzac Day, no sport, no shops, anything like that. And then when it got into the 70s, Vietnam War, lots of protests, people thinking that Anzac Day was a day where war was being glorified, so a lot of people were anti-Anzac Day. But then again, changing into the late 90s, and a lot of the veterans were starting to die, and people suddenly realised what we were losing, all those memories and that link to history. So I think it's a day that's changed and is still changing, and I think the way that it changes is part of its relevance to us today. One of the ways that it's changed is now there's so many children and families come to the dawn services, which is just lovely to see, and there's been a real revitalisation in the last maybe 10 years. So I think Anzac Day says a lot about us as a country, and it's continuing to change and have relevance today.
And as it changes, we learn more about maybe long forgotten facts.
I think so.
Tell us about your journey of discovery.
Well, I do think of it as like a journey, because when I was a child, I don't recall going to any Anzac Day services. Even as a young adult, I think it was really when I had children of my own and we started taking them to the Anzac service, which was at our local community. They were brownies and guides, and they were involved in the service through school. And then my husband started taking them, the oldest ones, down to the dawn service. And then we started thinking about our family history, and my two grandfathers, who were both in the First World War, and my great-great-aunt, who was one of the first New Zealand nurses in the First World War. So all those things sort of came together for me really, and started triggering my interest in it.
And talking about nurses, one of the facts that you cover in this book, there's a picture of your great-grand-aunt, of course, but there's also a photo of nurses at a French hospital. And what struck me was the ratio of nurses to soldiers in that hospital. What do we know about women in the war?
Well, again, that was something interesting that I learnt while I was researching. I wanted to tell the story from lots of different points of view, because I didn't want it just to be a story about young men going off to war, because I found that there were lots of other people that were affected, especially by World War I. I mean, basically the whole country was, because as well as the people that went off to war, there was the families that stayed back home, and of course the war affected them. But for the women, I found the story of the nurses really interesting, because originally the British government didn't want any New Zealand nurses. They thought they had plenty of their own. But the New Zealand nurses felt really strongly that if the New Zealand boys were injured or in hospital, they would want New Zealand nurses looking after them, which I'm sure is true. I think hearing a New Zealand voice must have been like medicine for them. So they fought very strongly to be able to go. And my great-great-aunt Louie was one of the first contingent of 50 nurses that went in, I think it was April 1915. So they were still on the way to Egypt when Gallipoli happened. But after that, a lot of them worked in Egypt or in France. I think that photograph is nurses in France. And they must have faced incredible hardships, terrible injuries that they'd have been looking after, and a lot of them would write home to the families, whether the soldier lived or died. They would send a note to the mother to tell her how they were doing. So I think they were heroines, really.
Absolutely.
And I can just remember meeting my great-great-aunt when I was very little and she was very old, and for me that's a very special link back to the First World War.
Why do you think it's important to recognise that it wasn't just New Zealand that sacrificed something?
I think it is important. I wanted to tell the Anzac story from different points of view and try and get children to understand that it wasn't just, it was young men going off to war, which is tragic, but there were so many other people involved, and there were people on both sides that, to get the full picture of war, I think we need to think about. One of the things about the Turkish soldiers is that a lot of them couldn't read and write, and there's an interesting story in there about how they got news from home, whereas our soldiers relied such a lot on letters and newspapers, but the Turkish soldiers relied on old men from the districts going around home collecting news from different households and then walking all the way to the front and passing the news on, and then taking their news back home again.
Yes.
So I think little details like that help you to understand what it was like for the other side.
Yes. We've talked about the photos that were helped to document the war and the letters that got sent home. How else do we get stories back about war in those days?
A lot of them kept journals, which were very eloquent, really. I suppose a lot of the letters were probably censored, but you can read the journals in libraries and archives, their journals and diaries. A lot of them, I think, used to send, when they did send letters home, if they were sending them to a community where a lot of boys had signed up at the same time, their parents would sometimes take them into the newspaper office, and then they would print them in the paper because everybody else in that area would have boys in the same kind of unit. So if they knew what one person was doing, they could guess what their own son might be doing.
And those communities back home, they would have been greatly impacted by the good news and the bad news coming back from them. The point towards the end of the book is that in war, nobody wins. That was a quote you used from one of the last remaining veterans.
Yes.
Do you think these days children growing up with so many wars on television, online, and violence and video games even, do you think there's a risk they could become desensitized to that, or even find it more difficult to understand what it was like in those days and the relevance of those lessons and sacrifices?
I think it's something that we've got to repeat to children over and over again, and I think often it's great to see so many children going to Anzac Day services, and they do. It's every year there's more and more, but I think it will help if they can understand more about what the service is all about and what it actually means and what we're trying to remember and what we're trying not to repeat. I think sometimes we assume they know more than they do. So I'm hoping that the book will try and explain some things for them and make some things clearer that perhaps they don't understand.
Well, Philippa, as somebody who hasn't grown up with the Anzac tradition, I found this book amazingly interesting and engaging, so thank you.
Thank you.
I was talking there with Philippa Wary about her book, Anzac Day, The New Zealand Story. After the break, the story of a war heroine who laid down her life for the children she loved. That's next. Welcome back. It's been nearly 70 years since the end of World War II. And as the number of people who survived the war diminishes, many stories of heroism may never be told. Our next story may have been one of those, but for the curiosity of a distant relative who was determined to find out the truth. When the war broke out, Scottish missionary Jane Haining was working as matron of a girls' hostel in Budapest, Hungary. Many of the children in her care were Jewish, and her love for them determined the path she would take when arrests and interrogations began. Jane's story has now been told in the book From Matron to Martyr, written by New Zealand journalist Lindley Smith, who has a personal link with Jane.
Jane Haining, who's the heroine of the story, was a distant relative of mine, and I discovered her story because of that. Because my mother gave me a little booklet about her story, and when I read that, it was so gripping I couldn't leave it.
And as you found out more about her, you followed in her footsteps. I mean, this is a Christian woman who went from Scotland to Hungary and ultimately to Auschwitz in Poland. Once you decided to write Jane's story, what happened next? What was it like when you followed in her footsteps?
Well, it was a very big decision. It was like jumping off a cliff, because I had to resign my job as a journalist, leave my home, tenanted, no home, no job. I did that because I really felt strongly God was calling me to write this story, that it had a special meaning, not just the story itself, but it's a message for the church and for the Jewish people. So I jumped off the cliff and went overseas, bought a round the world ticket and went. And God amazingly guided me just through every place I needed to go to. I knew I needed to visit all the places that she had been and lived in. And I did that. And in each place I found people who had kept a little bit of her story alive, even though it was, 65, 68 years ago.
How did you balance the facts that you gained from those resources with imagining and the storytelling of what it was like to get into Jane's skin?
Very easily. I don't think there was a problem doing that. The facts of the story spoke for themselves, and seeing them in context, being in those places made a very big difference. Plus, every little snippet that people could tell me just rounded out who she really was, so I could understand, because I knew I couldn't write the story if I didn't understand her.
So how did you come to understand her? Tell us a little bit about her character.
She had a very strong faith, a very deep and a very personal faith. She didn't shout it from the rooftops, but it was there very strongly, so strongly that she felt obliged to act on her faith and not just sit there and have a faith that didn't act. She was quite humble. She didn't contact people and tell them her inner thoughts and letters, that sort of thing. So research from that point of view was more difficult. But judging from comments by others who knew her at the time, comments from students that knew her and teachers who taught with her, I could build up a really good impression of what her personality was. And I think she was a very matter-of-fact and, I'm not going to let you push me around sort of person, yes.
That resoluteness and feistiness was somehow balanced with her calm. So when the Nazis invaded Hungary and came to arrest her, she chose to stay with the girls in her care. Why do you think she was so determined to stay?
One thing would be that she felt it was her duty, and she would be very strong on duty, yes. Another thing, and this is a very good question, did she really understand the dangers? And I really tried to look into that. And my conclusions, and I must emphasize they are my conclusions, was that yes, she did understand and she did it anyway.
And that ultimately led to her deportation to Auschwitz, Poland. And reading about Jane in the concentration camp made me think of Paul the Apostle, how he was a Christian too, like Jane, and imprisoned yet continuing to minister to those around her. So as readers and viewers, what can we learn about the nature of sacrifice and being obedient to God's will?
She didn't change. If she was ministering before, she would continue till the day she dropped, because that was the sort of person I believe she was. And in fact, I think a story within the story is how she came to come to terms with where the Lord was leading her. And I think for the Apostle Paul, it would also have been an issue. How do you come to terms with being put in jail and in chains when you know you have this mighty ministry? And how did she come to terms to being sent to Auschwitz? And there has to be a deeper faith that carries you through that, and I believe she had it. She epitomised the true Christian, I believe, in her love, which is the most important driving force in her life. She loved the Jewish people. She loved the Jewish children. She didn't abandon them. Now, God doesn't abandon us. It's the same thing. She would go as far as dying for those people if that was what had to happen, and Christ died for us. So she showed the true love of God for us, for the Jewish people, but for all people. So that's a very important thing to take from the story, I think. You don't choose your destiny, God does. So I'm sure she wouldn't have chosen that way, but I believe that when she came to an understanding of it and of the importance, perhaps not even of the importance of it, but now it has become very important because her story is starting to become known again, and the story of God's love for us is crucial at this time in this world, particularly for the Jewish people and for reconciliation between the Jewish people and the Gentile people. And if we don't understand God's love for the Jewish people firstly and everyone else as well, we're not going to come to a place of healing in the nations, and particularly Hungary is a wonderful example of this. It's a healing message.
Thank you so much for coming in and sharing that story with us, Lindley.
Thank you.
From matron to martyr, the story of Scottish woman Jane Haining. After the break, a memorial service to remember victims of the Holocaust. That's next. Welcome back to our special Anzac Day edition of Nzone Focus. Yom HaShoah is a day set aside each year to remember the millions of people who died in the Holocaust of World War II. Here in the North Island, a tree planting ceremony was recently held at Memorial Park in Hamilton to commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day. The event was organized by the Waikato Jewish Association and Christian Friends of Israel, and we joined the ceremony during the opening speeches.
It's our privilege to be able to stand here today on this day with the Jewish Society and the Jewish people as Christian Friends of Israel. The words of Yeshua, he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, because they will become the children of God." And so we thank you all for turning up. And I'm sure that the support to the Jewish people will be warmly accepted here today. Thank you.
20 years ago, as a young man, I was travelling around Austria, and I met a group of young Austrian men. I was shocked by their forceful views that denied the extent of the Nazi atrocities. They were passionate in their denial of the Holocaust, and such a view was abhorrent to me. It was abhorrent because, like so many of you, the family has its own history, its own story. I grew up with a friend of my grandfather. He'd served in the army, and he was demobbed and returned home in 1946. He was never the same again. On April the 15th in 1945, my grandfather's friend, Sidney, had found himself amongst the first through the gates of Bergen-Belsen as part of that liberating force. And there he saw the 13,000 unburied corpses and the 53,000 starving men and women, the survivors of the camp, and the children, many of whom were still to perish following liberation. These scenes were described by a journalist who was also with him that day from the BBC. And he wrote these words: "Here, over an acre of ground, lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful, ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way. unable to look at the terrible sights around them. Babies had been born here, tiny wizened things that could not live. A mother, driven mad, screamed at a British soldier to give her milk for her child, and then ran off crying terribly. He opened the bundle and found that the baby had been dead for days. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life. A few years ago, I made pilgrimage to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. We walked the Avenue of the Gentiles. We visited the grave of Oskar Schindler and others. We walked and we wept our way through the Children's Memorial, where the names of the 2 million children who perished are read out. There are those who deny its reality, those who question its severity, but there are those who were there, those who remember, but their numbers sadly are fewer each year. And of course there is people like us, people who gather in places like here all around the world on days like today. And we gather to remember, just in case, as the memorial says just over there, in case lest we forget. On Yom HaShoah, on this day of remembrance, we remember and we renew our pledge to not forget. For if we forget, we are destined to repeat. Thank you.
If you'd like to join me in reading the prayer, which is printed on your form there. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oseh ma'aseh bereshit. Praise are you, eternal God, sovereign of the universe, who makes the works of creation.
This liquid amber tree was planted as a memorial to all those who perished in the Holocaust during World War II from 1939 to 1945, and to those who sacrificed their lives to save Jewish people during that time. May it serve as a living reminder of the evils of discrimination, oppression, and genocide of all people all over the world. Planted and dedicated by the Waikato Jewish Association and Christian Friends of Israel on the Holocaust Remembrance Day, 7th of April 2013.
And that ends our special Anzac Day program. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Ka kite, God bless you.